thing, but my introduction will probably be really long here. So don't get worried when I mention the first point and you think it's almost time to be done because this is kind of the way it's laid out tonight. Now, this is a great passage of Scripture. By way of introduction, I want to start by just saying kind of like a disclaimer here, okay? I'll start by saying I'm going to get sort of personal on what's going on in my life right now. But understand whenever I do that this message isn't about me, okay? And you'll understand that as time goes. I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind if you start thinking, oh, why is he just talking about himself, okay? And I'm also going to talk about future pastor, Brother Allen, and mention a little bit about him, which obviously that is part of the motivation for this sermon. All my Thursday sermons have been kind of leading up to that, preparing everybody for this next year and all. But this sermon is not about him either, okay? So, but I want you to keep it in the back of your mind as I'm using illustrations, talking about people or whatever. Obviously, the text is about Paul, but I want you to know what Paul's trying to say, and it's the same thing that I'm trying to say, which is that this sermon, all the details I'm saying here, they're about you, okay? Because we all are in this together, and so I just want to make sure that you're thinking that, because at points I'm afraid you'll be tempted to think like, oh, he's just preaching about himself, or he's, just please put yourself into this and understand my heart on this, okay? So, I've already told many people last time, anytime something's going on in my life, it's probably going to come up in a message, okay, so you know that, but I've already talked a little bit about this last week, I believe, talking a little bit about how I started a job, okay, so I want to mention that a little bit, but here's some of my observations, okay, leading up to me taking a job over the last, of course, 5 years, 6 years. We've been getting this work started. A little bit before that, I had just taken over the pastorate in Iola. And I remember very early on as becoming a pastor, or even before I was a pastor actually, feeling really bad. Like in a way, there was something about me that felt very guilty about even receiving a salary for being a pastor. And I know it's kind of weird. Most pastors get paid, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that, as I'll point out in the scripture here in a bit. But I remember just feeling really bad, like it just didn't feel right in some ways, especially from Iola, where the congregation was shrinking, a lot of older folks who are giving a lot, and I felt like, man, I'm being a burden on them from that. And so it's always kind of been in the back of my mind, feeling a little bit guilty to receive an income, especially where I am and being a smaller church. In fact, I remember many preachers early on asking me, hey, are you able to be full-time? And the reason they were asking me is because they weren't. They were what people call bivocational, and I'm going to talk about that. Not actually the best probably way to describe, and I've used that term many times myself, but probably not the best way to describe what's going on whenever a pastor is working and being the pastor. It's not really bivocational, and I'll get to that here in a second, but so just keeping that back in the back of my mind all these years, and just feeling a little bit bad about it, but not thinking that I was necessarily doing anything wrong, but just having that guilt. And then I've met, since starting this work, I've met many people who do work a full-time job and then put a lot of work into this ministry or whatever ministries they're doing. In fact, many times people have come to me and say, man, you're just so busy. I don't know how you do it. And I'm thinking like, man, I don't work. That's kind of how I felt. Now, I have maintained a job early in the mornings. I go clean and stuff. So I guess there's that, but I still felt like I don't have a job. Like, I don't have like a full-time job. And I'm thinking like all these guys who come in straight from work and they didn't even have time to change. And then they show up here and they go soul winning and I couldn't really relate to that in many ways, to be honest with you, after years of being a pastor. And of course, it would have been really difficult for me to get a full-time job and be able to pastor 2 churches. But the way I always looked at that in my mind was that when I started this work, I was like, well, that's that time, right, invested in something else, whereas a lot of preachers would have a full-time job. My full-time job, let's just say, was this maybe, or whichever church you want to look at, congregation you want to look at, but then, also, being paid by doing that. Anyway, I think you understand what I'm saying. And so then here recently, it's kind of out of necessity, just to be honest with you. I've had to take this on, but not being discouraged whatsoever, because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, I'm asking Brother Allen to do it. Like, in a manner of speaking, I know that he can't take a salary when he starts pastoring here. And so he's going to be working a full-time job, and he's going to be putting in all the work, and he's already putting in a lot of work as the deacon. And so surely if I can expect that out of somebody else, I need to be expecting to do that myself. And that's one of the things that's going on. And it's funny because I kind of think of it like, I remember when this work got started, and then a lot of families started coming, and they're all having babies, and I remember thinking like, hey, I'm out of touch. I don't remember what it was like to have a baby. So God gave us a baby, right? Then I'm like, I'm out of touch, man. I don't remember what it's like to work a full-time job and then serve in the church. Like, and trust me, when I used to work 2 jobs and serve in the church, probably putting in as many hours with the bus ministry and all that stuff. Not like I do now, but a lot of hours still into the church work. And so I do know that I could do it, but I was kind of out of touch. And so now the Lord's allowed me to go through that and kind of be an example with that. And so, I remember thinking, just not necessarily as a pastor, but many people who are in ministry. Great example is Brother Schmooky. I talk about him a lot, but that was early on one of the things that really stuck out to me, because we had a lot of missionaries that we were supporting early on. We still support probably too many for what we can actually take in Iola, but early on, I remember thinking, hey, we're paying these people to go do that, and they spend like 4 years raising support, sometimes, and then after they get enough support raised, then they go to and then everybody's still paying them, and then they come back into the meetings, and the church kind of treats them like a rock star and takes care of them and spoils them, and I'm not downing that. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing to do, or that they shouldn't be in the ministry or something like that, not at all. But it just really stuck out to me that you had somebody like Brother Schmooky and many people in this church who work a full-time job, and then they just go and they preach the gospel without anybody recognizing them, without anybody giving them money, nobody patting them on the back. In fact, a lot of people even saying like, oh, you guys don't do it right, or you guys shouldn't be doing that. Oh, you just love numbers. You just want to be seen by men. And it's just like, no, actually, we work a full-time job, raise a family, do all these things, and then put in the time to go soul winning and all that stuff, and nobody's getting paid for it. And I remember just really thinking through, like, if I had to choose, I mean, that's the kind of people I would want to give my money to, are those kind of people. But then at the same time, it's just like, would that change them if they were getting paid to do what they were doing instead of just freely giving it and just putting in that time? You see what I'm saying? So I've always felt a little guilty about that, thinking like, maybe I should be a bivocational pastor. And then as I really started thinking about that term, bivocational pastor, well, that's not even really how it works. Look at Ephesians chapter 4. Hold your place. We will be back in 2 Corinthians 12. But go over to Ephesians chapter 4. And Paul says to the church of Ephesus, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that ye walk worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called. Now, who's he talking to? He said ye, that's plural, okay? So we know he's not just talking to one person like Timothy or Titus or something like that. He's talking to people. With all lowliness and meekness, with long suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, even as ye are called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. And to every one of us is given grace according to the measure of the gift of Christ. So really, we all have the same vocation. Our vocation is we've all been called into the ministry. All right, if you're saved and you've decided, hey, I'm going to follow the Lord, I'm going to be a disciple. First step, baptism, right? And then you're just like, I'm on board with this. I'm going to join a church. I'm going to get involved. I'm going to go soul winning. I'm going to do all that. Well, welcome aboard. Welcome to the team. Welcome to the family, right? Like all the workforce always wants to talk about, hey, we're a big family. Well, welcome to your vocation. You are now in the ministry, okay? But wait a minute. You're not getting paid for it. What are you going to do? Well, here's what you do. You work a full-time job so that you can pay the bills and provide for your family. You raise your family, try to spend enough time giving to your family and loving your family and raising them up like you're supposed to. And then, as much as possible, you get to do what you've been called to do with your vocation. Plus, your vocation continues, like you're still a soul winner when you're on the job. Now, don't get in trouble and preach the gospel whenever you're supposed to be on the clock and get in trouble by your boss. But people are watching you at your job. You're ministering to people. Even this last week, like I have the advantage of people knowing that I'm a pastor, so obviously that generates more questions. Maybe people don't necessarily know that you go preach the gospel regularly, but my trainer has kind of like spread the word around. I think he's been like, hey, watch what you say. He's a pastor, or something like that. But word has got around, and everybody, like when they introduce me, I heard you're a pastor. And I've actually had a few people come up to me and say, hey, I have some questions for you. I'd like to sit down and talk to you. I want to ask you about this. And it's just like, whoa, man, this is like the mission field's coming to me. You don't clock out of the ministry. You see what I'm saying? Your vocation is the ministry. So for a pastor to call themselves bivocational, no. I have one vocation, right? And the going to work is just to make it happen. You see what I'm saying? To be able to support that and to allow that to happen. Now, I know a lot of people that go to churches and call themselves Christians don't feel this way. But I'm just saying that this is the way that everybody in here should feel, okay? And so why is a pastor who's willing to do that, what makes that different? Well, the only thing would be that he is leading an example about how we all should be. And I remember thinking, like, man, this would be a great opportunity, actually, to show people, hey, I can work a full-time job, I can, take care of my family, I can provide all these things, and still give of my time to the church, just like everyone's asked to do. Okay, my responsibility is just a little different. So, like Paul said right in Ephesians 4, he said, hey, we've all got different gifts. There's different ways that we contribute to the ministry. There's different things that we're good at, or this person's called to do this person's called to do that. But we're all of the same vocation, okay, and the same calling. Now, I do agree. I mean, you can't deny Scripture and the Bible does teach that being a pastor is an honorable position. Okay, a person that decides to be a pastor, 1 Timothy 3 says he desireth a good work. Okay, and chapter 5 says that a pastor who rules well is worthy of double honor. Right, especially they that labor in the word. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. So we understand the Bible does teach that, hey, it's a position that should be respected, and there's blessings in heaven, I believe, for somebody who would decide to give themselves to that. But it doesn't make the pastor any different or more valuable to the ministry than anybody else in the church, is what I'm getting at. Okay. I also do believe that it is right, because of that honorable position, and this is hard to say as a pastor, but it is right that people should honor their pastor, okay? Recently, we had Pastor's Appreciation, which I didn't even know. Pastor's Appreciation Month was going on. A couple people went out of their way to give me gifts and to do different things, and I was very humbled by that and felt very, like, unworthy, like, undeserving. Like, what is this? Like, I'm just one of you. Like, you know what I mean? But let's just be honest. Like, no pastor should get up and be like, yeah, that's right. I deserve that. Now, I've actually heard of Brother Sam Davison used to talk about this pastor he worked for, and he always had great respect for him. And he said one day they bought him a car. And no, I'm not trying to hint. I'm just kidding. They bought him a car, and he had been there for a long, like 20 some years or whatever. And I don't know. I think somebody was rich in that church or something. And they bought him a car, but he said he said there was no problem with that. He thought that was a good thing that they did and all that stuff. But he said that he got up there and said, basically, this is Brother Sam's testimony, that he got up there and said, like, well, I deserve it. because I've done this for you guys and I've done that for you guys. And he said, like, he suddenly lost all respect for that pastor because, who does he think he is to say, like, I deserve this, okay? That's not why you should be in the ministry. And there are a lot of people that go into the ministry thinking, when I was in Bible college, and everybody's thinking like, hey, I want to pastor that big church where they're going to pay me a big salary and I'm going to have all these kinds of things. And that's just wicked. And the Bible calls that wicked for any pastor to get into the ministry with that mentality, with that mindset. Okay. A lot of guys that did find out at work that I'm a pastor, I don't know what they're thinking that a pastor does, but they're like, well, if you're a pastor, like, why are you working? It's kind of like, don't they pay you well? And I'm like, obviously, you've never been to an independent fundamental Baptist church or one of the smaller ones. Most people are shocked that they can even pay their pastor, okay? So I do think it's right for people, and I have some scriptures written down, but I'm going to pass on those right now, that do, talk about honoring that position. In fact, in this text where Paul is saying why he didn't ever take money from anybody, but he actually worked, and we know from Scripture, we'll look at it here in a minute, what the job was that he did to be able to support himself and to support those who were with him. But as he's talking here in 2 Corinthians 12, there's this interesting verse in here, verse 13, where he says, for what is it wherein ye were inferior to other churches, except it be that I myself was not burdensome to you? Forgive me this wrong. It sounds almost like he's saying, like, hey, probably I hurt you by not making you give of yourself like some of these other churches did, where they gave of themselves and their poverty. Well, how's that one passage say? Like their deep poverty. You just preached on that. They gave of themselves and all that stuff. And so he's actually saying, like, hey, maybe I did you wrong by kind of spoiling you a little bit and not making you have to dig down deep and provide for that work. But then he spends the rest of the time explaining why he did it. Okay, so you can understand then that Paul is saying, like, hey, it's not a bad thing for you to take care of the person who's ministering to you. There's a lot of great verses on that. In fact, I probably should go back. Well, we're in, let's see, go back to 1 Corinthians 9. I think that's the one. I will read one of these here. Let's see here. Yeah, in this passage he says, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? If I be not an apostle unto others, yea, doubtless I am to you. Let's see here. Verse 4, have we not power to eat and drink? Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as our brother in the Lord Cephas, or I only and Barnabas, have we not power to forbear working? So he's like, hey, Paul even gave up having a relationship. Now, he wasn't a pastor. That's a qualification of being a pastor. But he didn't even give himself to a wife and children, and he didn't have that on his plate. He decided to stay single and serve the Lord. And he's like, hey, but I can, just like the other apostles, like I can get married if I wanted to get married. And I would have that on my plate. He said, I can decide, hey, I'm not going to take on a job. You need to provide for me. He says, I could do all that. But he chooses not to do that. And there's several places in the Bible that talks about this, okay? Now, it's common for some pastors to be not only paid, but also be at the forefront of their ministry. A lot of times people will call it their ministry. I've used that term before too, just because it's something that's been passed down, like, hey, this is my ministry. But then you get to where it's just like Pastor Rocky Randall Ministries, Joyce Meyer's ministry. No, that's where it kind of rubs you the wrong way, doesn't it? Like, to me, it does when the ministry is named after that pastor, and he's just, everybody is just, I don't know. It's just like they got this. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's just like all the emphasis is on this great speaker, Billy Graham's crusades and ministries. Like he got all the recognition for that. Not inherently wrong. Now I'm not a Billy Graham fan, obviously, but I'm just saying, just generally speaking, it's not necessarily wrong that he got recognition for the ministry that he was doing, that he was good at. But at the same time, it kind of rubs you the wrong way that a man would be praised and get all the recognition and all that kind of stuff. So Paul explains here why he chose not to be that. Now, obviously, he is now. Everybody knows the name Paul the Apostle, and everybody reads the Bible and knows that a big portion of the Bible is either about him or his writings to churches. And so for sure, he gets the recognition now. At that time, he was willing to not get the recognition, okay? And so in order to make his point here to this church of Corinth, which is apparently saying some negative things about him. If you read both letters, actually, apparently they're saying some negative things about him. And so he's trying to make this point here. And in order to make his point, he actually has to toot his own horn a little bit. He brags a little bit on himself, okay? And look at verse 11, 2 Corinthians 12:11. He says, I am become a fool in glorying. Ye have compelled me, for I ought to have been commended of you. For in nothing am I behind the very chiefest apostles, though I be nothing. Okay, he's like, hey, yeah, I don't feel like I'm anything, but I am an apostle, and you should be commending me. He's like, and so you've made me become a fool because I have to tell you that you should be commending me. Is basically what he's saying. And he said the same thing in chapter 9. Look at chapter 9. No, let's see. We just looked at that, didn't we? Chapter 11. Let's see. Look at verse 21. He says, I speak as concerning reproach. And this is just the chapter right before, right? So we know he's talking about the same kinds of things here. Concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly. I am bold also. So he, again, doesn't really want to give himself praise, but he feels compelled to do that at the time. And so he says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant. And then he starts describing all the stuff that he's been through. I got to just read it. He says, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, beside those things which are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the cares of all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is offended and I burn not? If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern mine infirmities. And so then in chapter 12, he talks about his infirmities, okay? And he's even kind of tooting his own horn, if you will, out of necessity, in his opinion. He's kind of tooting his own horn a little bit when he talks about knowing this person who was caught up into the third heaven. Because I think it's real clear when you read the text that he's talking about himself. He just doesn't want to say, I got to see the Lord. I had a special vision of Christ, and I got caught up to the third heaven, which other passages of Scripture show that he did that. But here he's like, I know this man. Whether he was in the body or out of the body, I don't know, but he was caught up into the third heaven, and he's basically like, hey, man, that is something to glory about. He's like, yeah, but here on this earth, he's like, I'm not going to glory in anything except my infirmities. He's like, I'm going to be happy to just be miserable. I'm happy to be weak, happy to be suffering for the Lord. And he explains why this is. Look at verse 14. I think this is a very important verse here. He says, behold, the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you. For I seek not yours, but you. Of course, that's the title of the message. I seek not yours, but you. I seek not yours, but you. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. Now it'd be really crazy for me to be like, hey, Zach and Braden, you know, just remember, you owe me for all the years. So one of them, all right, Braden, not that you would wonder who it was, but Braden sent me this video, wanted to show me this video where this guy's like, he's like, parents always say, hey, I feed you and I give you a place to live and I do that. And he's just like, isn't that what you're supposed to do? I'm your child. You had me. And I think that's a good point. Like, that's natural. What we're supposed to do is give to our children. Now, that might be a bad attitude for a child to have, but we are naturally going to take care of them and provide for them and all that. It'd be really weird for me to be like, hey, don't you forget, I'm raising you so that you can give to me. You could provide for me. Well, we'll see if that happens, right? We don't expect anything from our kids. We want our kids to have what we have. We want to pass something on to them. And so Paul often refers to the people he's ministering to kind of like his kids, all right? Now, they didn't call him father, but he refers to them kind of like his kids, and he's like, hey, I should be laying up for you. It's only natural that I'd want to give of myself. I mean, parents, good parents, will give of themselves to their kids until they have nothing. You know what I mean? Until they're just miserable. And they, not miserable because they love doing it, but you know what I mean? Miserable as far as the flesh is concerned about, man, I've given all I can give and I can't give anymore. Maybe you've read your child the story of the giving tree. I love that story where the tree just gives everything until it's just a little stump. And finally, the little boy who's asking all these things, taking all these things from the tree, takes the wood and sells it. It takes the trunk and it makes a canoe out of it so it can sail away, and the boy can sail away. And in the end, it's just a little stump. And the boy comes back, he's a fully grown old man, and he sits on the stump, and it's like, even to the very last moment, that giving tree gave of itself. And I'm thinking, every time I read that, I'm just like, that's how moms are, you know what I mean? They'll just give of themselves till they're nothing but a stump, and then they'll give of themselves as a stump, all right? I don't know why that sounds offensive, but, I mean that in a loving way. All right. So, Paul here is explaining why he is giving of himself and why he doesn't want to ask them for money and expect them to take care of him and all this kind of stuff. And he doesn't really talk about it much, but at this point he feels like it's necessary to bring it up out of love and concern for the people. And so he brings it up, and here's what he says. Number one, he says that he doesn't want to be a burden to them. He doesn't want to cause them to be like, oh man, and just, you know, have to, I gotta help this guy. I gotta feed his family. Well, of course, Paul didn't have a family, but so he didn't want to be a burden. And so, verse 14, again, he says, I didn't want to be burdensome to you. It says it several times in here that he doesn't want to be a burden. And as ministers, again, we all are ministers, right? We all have this vocation. So I'm not just talking about myself or Brother Allen or anybody in particular. We're all ministers. And as ministers, we don't want to be a burden. We would rather take the burden from somebody else. That's what a minister is. A minister means a servant, right? We want to take their burden away from them, not to put burden upon them by being burdensome, okay? And typically a good minister, somebody who God is going to use in a good way in the ministry, reaching people and all, is going to be somebody with this attitude, because they're giving of themselves, and it's not that they just want to take from people and all that. Okay, Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. I just recently preached on, I used this in a message, and I can't remember if it was here or in Iowa, but it doesn't matter. I'm always kind of struck by this because it says in verse 2, Galatians 6, it says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. But let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. For every man shall bear his own burden. And I always thought it was weird that it says, bear one another's burdens, and then it says, hey, every man should bear his own burden. It's not contradictory. The thing is that you should be concerned about bearing your own burden, carrying your own weight, taking care of yourself, taking care of your family and all your own needs, not expecting other people to do that. But then at the same time, as a minister, you're willing to not only do that, but to also carry someone else's burden. Just throw a little bit more on your already busy life and your already burdensome life, and just say, hey, you know what? I got room for more. Give me your burden. You say, man, that just doesn't sound fair. Well, I mean, it's certainly the example Christ set for us. And so he is just asking us to do that. It's not like God's not watching. It's not like God's not going to reward you for that effort. But we shouldn't want to be burdensome to people. And pastors should set the example, okay? So I personally believe pastors should tithe. Okay, now some people think that's weird. Like if I'm talking about if a pastor is receiving an income from the church, then their tithes are paying for that. And so if he tithes on top, it's almost like, hey, why don't we just give you less money and then you won't have to tithe? Well, because the principle of tithing is a biblical principle. You know, some people will say like, well, it's not New Testament. Well, I don't see anywhere in the Bible where it was done away with. And I don't see where it started in the law of Moses. It actually started before Moses. And so the argument could be made that God still expects us to do that. Now, anyone that's just like, oh, tithing's not in the Bible, it's usually someone that doesn't want to give anything to the church. Because you think, oh, that was an Old Testament thing. New Testament doesn't talk about tithing. Okay, well, what does the New Testament talk about giving? Like you see people selling all their possessions and having all things common, and it's like, you really want to give that? You going to give that way and just give until you're super poor? You don't have anything? Paul says, no, I think it should be somewhat of an equality. I'm not trying to ask more burden on somebody else, but everybody should give what they can give. And when he says it's kind of an equality, you know, in my mind it thinks like, well, tithing is exactly equal. Everybody's paying a tenth, right? It's not like, hey, this guy's paying more than this person, or this more of a burden on this person because he doesn't have as much money. Well, if he doesn't have as much money, then a tenth of what he makes is not as big of a burden, right? It's the same amount of burden on anybody, okay? I wish our government would pick up on that and institute a flat tax, okay? But that's my only political statement that I have to say behind the pulpit. Okay. So pastors, I believe, should tithe. And actually, you can also go into the Old Testament and show in the Levitical priesthood, the idea was that all 12 tribes, you know, they would give of their tithes to the, you know, they'd bring them to the tabernacle, except for the Levites, who were the priests, right? They didn't have houses and land and all that kind of stuff. Their job was just to serve in the tabernacle. I started to say church. It's fine. Same idea. And they would serve there, and they didn't have a sacrifice to bring because they didn't raise cattle and all this kind of stuff. And so what would happen is all the other tribes would contribute their tenth, and then that would go to pay for the priest, who now would have something to bring as a sacrifice. And so you can kind of see that same principle. Like, I want to give something to the Lord, okay, so I take from the money that comes in from the church to pay for my needs, but then I also give back to you see what I'm saying? Like, I think even a pastor that is paid a full-time salary should still be tithing and giving above and beyond a tithe, I believe, as far as, you know, what he would expect others to do, because he's leading by example. And he should be a hard worker, not just like, hey, I preach and I fulfill my responsibilities as the pastor. You guys do the rest of the work. No, a pastor, and of course, it's hard to find. So most people who become a pastor, they kind of already have this instinctive, you know, desire to serve. And so, you know, they're going to be the hard worker. They're the one that you're always seeing, like, giving of themselves and working hard and all that stuff. Hey, learn from that. They're setting an example for you. That's why they do it. Number two, not only does he not want to be burdensome, but it says he will gladly, and I've kind of already touched on this, but he says he will gladly spend and be spent for them. Okay, not just to not be a burden, but he's like, you know what, I'll give to you, and I'll sacrifice of myself for you. Look, I'll tell you this, what I have found about being a pastor who is working a full-time job, and let me toot my own horn, okay? Hey, Paul did it. I'm not really tooting my own. But, you know, here's been my week lately, because I have to train on day shift, okay? Now, I'm complaining, and some of you guys do this all the time. I get it, okay? I'm not complaining, but I'm just telling you how difficult this is, okay? But lately I've been getting up like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I got this cleaning job, which I've always had that job, right? And I go clean that. Now, Lord willing, I'll be giving that away here pretty soon. I go straight from there, basically to work, do my Bible reading and my studying and try to get things ready until 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock I clock in, and then I work until 3:30. 3:30 I get out, and it's just like, hey, I better get all my stuff done before 5 because everything closes at 5, right? And so I do that. If it's a church day, obviously I got to have my sermon ready so I can preach on Wednesday. On Thursdays I get right out of work, get washed up, jump in the car, come here. This has been my last 2 weeks, and I'll just tell you, like, that's tiring. Okay, well, I don't know what I expected, but guess what? That's tiring. And like I said, I know that some of you guys do this regularly. You're working 2 jobs, you're trying to do all this and still trying to make it to soul winning, still try to go to church. And I can respect that because it's tiring, okay? But will you gladly spend and be spent for the sake of not just your family, because that's, and even an infidel takes care of their family, right? You're worse than an infidel, the Bible says, if you don't provide for your own family. So obviously, if you don't work, you shouldn't eat. And if you have a family, you should take care of your family. But would you be willing to even go above and beyond that and say, hey, I'm going to spend and be spent for the sake of the ministry, ministering to others? Don't just expect your pastor to do that, and your deacon to do that, and your missionaries to do that. No, we all have the same vocation, and we all should be expected to work hard and still make time to give of ourselves to the ministry, and still give our time to the Lord, and still stay up on our Bible reading and our studies and our prayer time. Don't let that fall away, or else I'm going to tell you this, everything will fall away. Everything will fall apart if you give up on that. So put the Lord first, put your family second, and then just serve. That's the example that we see in the Bible. Okay, in fact, he says in verse 10 that he takes pleasure in these things. 2 Corinthians 12:10, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. I'll tell you this, even though this last 2 weeks has been burdensome, there's something weird about it where I've just felt extra spiritual. It's like all of a sudden I feel like, well, I'm not just doing the ministry because it's my job. That's actually what God's put in my heart to do. And it's just become more of a passionate thing. Hey, I've got to take care of my family because I love my family. Hey, I got to preach because God's called me to preach. Hey, I got to make time for soul winning. I got to make time for all these things. And it's just become like, not, my vocation isn't like, hey, clock in, clock out. I fulfilled my role. Now let me go do what I want to do. No, it's just, I love the Lord, and so I'm going to glory in infirmities. And again, this message isn't about me. I wanted to make this clear because I'm telling you, what I'm getting at is that we all should have this attitude. We all should have this spirit. And I'm learning that in this last couple weeks because I have to put myself through this. And it's like, hey, guess what? That's the Christian life. We're all supposed to be willing to do this. The third point here, he was willing to be loved less. A guy who's not recognized and, all the billboards, hey, welcome Pastor so-and-so, he's coming to preach this revival meeting, and oh, we all love him, and hey, just support him, give to his ministry, and all this kind of stuff. Like, those guys, people love them. They love those guys. They can't wait to hear him preach and all this kind of stuff, all right? But I'm telling you, to live a life where you're just giving of yourself and you're spending and being spent and all that kind of stuff, that's not a way to get popularity and to be loved by the masses. Okay? And Paul is telling the church of Corinth, he's like, look, the more I do these things, the more I love you, the less I feel like you love me, because you aren't actually respecting that I do it. And I'm not talking from my perspective. I'm saying this is what Paul is basically telling the church of Corinth. And he's saying, hey, I feel like I'm less loved whenever I live this way. Like I could go out there and feel more loved by, being full-time, just preaching and doing all these kinds of things and putting my name out there and all this kind of stuff. He's like, but actually I feel like I'm less and less loved as I give of myself and I do this. I'm not recognized and all this kind of stuff. But I will tell you this, that you're going to be very loved if you give of yourself like this. You're going to be loved by your family. You're going to be loved by your church members who see that. They know that you have that heart and you have that life, and they truly love you, okay? Look, I've been in the ministry long enough and I've gone to preachers' meetings long enough to know that here's how a lot of preachers treat other preachers, okay? How big is their church? How much are they liked? Could they have me come preach at their meeting? Oh, I think this guy might, I think this guy, I need to sit down and talk to this guy, and then I'll be well liked and I'll be introduced to his friends and all that kind of stuff. And then you got a guy who's not so well known, and he's just like, hey, how you doing? And the guy's like, hey, I'm doing pretty good. How are you? Man, I've seen it so many times. And it's just like, hey, you're not really that important. I'm looking for the guys who are recognized and well known. But guess what? That person that he just shook their hand, that person might be working 2 jobs and trying to hold a church together that's falling apart and loving his family and doing all these kinds of things. Might never be loved, might never be recognized. But the people who truly love him, they appreciate it. And guess what? At the end of the day, God's watching and God knows, and God's the rewarder of these kinds of things. And we all should be like this, again, not just pastors. We all should have this heart, not looking to be loved by everybody, but to be loved by those to whom we're ministering. The last point is, I'll be real quick here because I don't have a lot to say about it anyway. He says that, and look at verse 16. He says, but be it so, I did not burden you. Nevertheless, being crafty, I caught you with guile. Okay, now that sounds weird because guile there is kind of this idea of being crafty. And one word that a lot of people would say is tricky, like I tricked you, okay? Now, trick sounds like lying and being deceiving and all that stuff. Being crafty is not bad, though. Overall, is not bad. I think that what he's saying here, he's saying, I caught you with guile. I think what he's saying is, hey, I got what I wanted for you. I got you saved. I got you into church. I got whatever it is that Paul has invested in these guys. And it's like, they don't even know it. You see what I'm saying? He's like, I was crafty. Here I am working. I'm making tents and all this kind of stuff. And I'm behind the scenes working things out. And I'm setting all these kind of things up. And all these people have grown. And they've been saved. And they're learning scripture and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, and you don't even know that I was the one behind it. Okay? And I'm saying that because I think all Christians, we should be like this. Hey, have you ever, all right, let's use this as an example. Have you ever told a funny joke and you told it to one person and he laughed, and then like a big crowd comes by and that person that you told the joke to, he tells the joke and everybody laughs and you're like, hey, that was my joke. No? Am I the only one that's done that? Let's see, maybe there's a better example. All right, I'll tell you, as a pastor, I've preached before, and maybe I'll make a point or something like that, and like 2 weeks later, somebody will come to me and they'll be like, hey, have you ever thought of this? And they'll tell me something, and I'll think in my head, like, I preached that like 2 weeks ago. I just preached on that. Like, are you sure you're not saying that because you heard me preach that? But see, the Christian thing to do, the thing to do as a minister is to be like, I'm just glad that they got it. Not to be like, hey, give me credit for that. You see what I'm saying? And so I think Paul's like, hey, I was crafty and I caught you with guile. Okay, he's like, you don't even know that I'm working behind the scenes to make all this kind of stuff work, so that your burden can be relieved, so that you can grow, so that you can be profited. And Paul is like hating to even say this. He's like, I speak like a fool. Like, I don't want to say this. Like, you've made me have to say this. You've made me have to be a fool. And he's doing this. And I think that we could all learn from that. Okay. Now, again, I want to just clarify that I got very personal and I talked about my own situation, and it could very well sound like I'm saying like, hey, you don't know what I'm going through, and you need to know that so that I can get credit for it. I don't want you to think that, but I do want you to know my heart. I do want you to know why it is. Maybe you heard something about me picking up a job and you're just like, man, does he just love money so much that he has to go pick up another job so that he can have money? Like, why doesn't he give himself 100% to God and just live by faith? Well, I mean, I feel like God allowed me to get that job and worked everything out, and I believe that's where I'm doing exactly what he wants me to do right now. Okay, so I want you to know why I'm doing that, but more importantly, I want you to learn from the example, not just my example, but Brother Allen's example, somebody like Brother Kurt Schmucke, and thousands of other people I could mention, some right here in this room, who give of themselves, work tirelessly, and you wouldn't even know it. They come to church, they got a smile, they're the first ones to serve, they're the ones that are out there for all the soul winning events, and you wouldn't even know that they are working themselves to death, trying to keep everything afloat. Well, you know what? We ought to pray for these people, and we ought to just be very appreciative of what they're doing, but more importantly, we should learn from that example and be like, hey, maybe I can give a little more of myself for others. All right, let's go to Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for this great example that we have in the Bible from the Apostle Paul. More importantly, Lord, the example we have from Christ. And I'm thankful that Paul, even in all his glorying, although I felt he was very humble about it, but his glorying, he still recognized that, hey, he's not doing anything that Christ didn't do. And we thank you for that example of Christ giving of himself to us and being our minister. And I pray that you help all of us who have been saved and who have decided to follow Jesus. We've decided to be disciples and to show our love for you. I pray, Lord, that you just help us to keep in mind why we're doing what we're doing, and to keep giving to people, even if we're not going to be recognized for it, even if we have no benefit in this life for it, and nobody even knows maybe the amount of work that we're doing. Lord, I pray that you help us just do it anyway, because you're watching and because people need us. Help us bear other people's burdens, but also be able to take care of our own burden. Give us the strength to do it. Give us the heart and the desire to do it. And I pray you be glorified in all of it. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right, let's stand.